Stories from the East and West. Hey Leah.
Hey John.
Do you remember what happened at the end of the last episode?
Well, you asked me a lot of questions and
you left me hanging with all of them. Not cool.
And so here we are, the Palace of Culture's story, part 2.
You had better do a super short introduction for those who haven't listened to the previous episode and might not even know what the Palace of Culture is.
I strongly recommend listening to it because it certainly will make our listeners understand this one better.
There's no time for that. You've got 60 seconds to do a recap.
What?
My stopwatch is out. Ready, steady, go.
It's 1945, World War II is over and Poland is on the winning Allied side, but the Yalta Peace Conference ends up sticking it on the eastern side of the Iron Curtain. Poland is forced to become dependent on the Soviet Union. The country's capital, Warsaw, witnessed 2 huge uprisings during the war which led the Nazi Germans to almost completely destroy it out of revenge for its insolence. The people of Poland didn't know whether rebuilding the practically non-existent city made any sense and were trying to decide whether to move Poland's capital elsewhere. But eventually, especially since former inhabitants started coming back and rebuilding the city by themselves, even living in the rubble, the country decided to take on a massive reconstruction of Warsaw as a symbol of Poland being alive and kicking. The Office for Reconstruction of Warsaw comes together and works gets underway. Meanwhile, Stalin, the crazy Soviet leader, decides to quote-unquote help Poland by offering it a gift, a huge skyscraper named after him. This Stalinist Gothic palace was supposed to be a gift from the people of the Soviet Union to the people of Poland. No one can oppose Stalin's will, so the palace, later called the Palace of Culture and Science, is placed right in the middle of the city and becomes its central point and symbol. Even though the initial plan of finishing the construction in 2.5 to 3 years seemed crazy, even to Soviet engineers, they managed to do it right on time despite several deaths along the way. In 1955, the palace is ready. So we have a city slowly recovering from annihilation and a huge white palace built by the country's unwanted supervisor.
Congratulations. I mean, time was up ages ago, Leah, but you almost did it.
Yeah, well...
You okay?
Let's just cut to the intro music, okay? Hi, my name is Leah.
And I'm John, and this is Stories from the East and West.
In today's show, we're discussing the social life of one of Poland's most famous landmarks, the Palace of Culture and Science. We're also looking at its impact on a city that had to reinvent itself from scratch barely 70 years ago, Warsaw.
Some people think the palace should be covered in ivy in order to make it more friendly.
Yes, we will be packing in a handful of wonderful anecdotes, even mysteries, jokes, and legends. We have a lot to talk about, so off we go.
Okay, so now my questions. First off, you said last time that nobody had any real idea of how the building ought to be used.
Yes, keep in mind it wasn't built because it was necessary, but because Stalin wanted to show off Soviet domination on this side of the Iron Curtain. To clearly demonstrate the new order where the working class is the one with privilege and respect.
Okay, enough of the proletariat stuff. But what did they actually finally use it for? I can't imagine it was empty. At least, it isn't now.
It was supposed to be a palace for the people, but also a symbol of power, and it combined those two functions from a very early stage. You know, maybe now is the perfect time to give our listeners a tour around the palace. They'll understand the place best by going sightseeing.
Given that this is an audio show, maybe you mean hear-seeing.
No, I don't. That sounds awful. But yes, this will be an audio tour. Quite a tangible one, actually. Let's go. So we went to the palace some time ago and met...
Erika, I am a guide in the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw.
And...
Kate, I'm also a guide.
They took us on an almost 2-hour walk around the palace, and it turns out that the place is full of halls and chambers, and that each one is named after a Polish or Soviet hero, and each one has some sort of function. Sometimes it's a surprising one.
We're in the hall of Nicolaus Copernicus, so the really famous Polish scientist. Apparently this place was a smoking room.
We are in Mickiewicz chamber. We consider Mickiewicz as the most important Polish poet of all time.
Right now we're in Valentina Tereshkova Hall.
That's the first female Soviet cosmonaut.
We just entered Lev Rudniev's chamber. Now it's a conference room, but during the communism it was used for international meetings for members of Warsaw Pact.
If you remember our last episode, Runev was of course the architect of the palace. And actually that hall was very modern given that it was built in the early 1950s. There were even interpreters' booths in there, well isolated from the rest of the hall. Their only flaw was that the air conditioning was rather low-tech.
Okay, so here we have boxes. These boxes were for interpreters. Let's go inside the box. So as you can see, we have a hole in the ceiling. That's air conditioning, because you can imagine spending 8 hours here translating. Everybody smoked cigarettes during the communism, so when you smoke cigarettes here for 8 hours, you could faint. So they just made small holes in the ceiling as air conditioning.
The box was so claustrophobic that we really were on the verge of fainting. We moved on to the VIP rooms of the one and only Leonid Brezhnev.
Right now we are in Brezhnev VIP halls. So the name of the Brezhnev is of course really connected with Soviet Union, but the thing is that it was his favorite place when he was coming to Warsaw.
Do you remember when we told you the palace is full of myths, legends, and strange stories? Our guides were the true bearers of those stories. After all, their job is to present the palace in the most interesting and fun way. They told us stories as improbable as this one.
There is a story connected with when he came here once. The legend says that Brezhnev got really drunk. He was generally pretty well known from drinking a lot. And once he got so drunk that nobody could actually wake him up, and they were pretty scared that they won't be able to wake him up anymore. So the story created the name of the offices of the VIP halls.
You know, I don't think they named those VIP halls because Brezhnev got blackout drunk in it, and Kate probably doesn't either. But this is part of what the palace is. It's a remnant of communism that's constantly mocked, and it serves as an image of the folksy, funny, and even pathetic face of communism. There are also all sorts of mysteries told about the place. For example, Eric told us about a secret passage.
Behind this door there is a secret corridor leading under the stage of Congress Hall, and there's elevator going up, so he could just stay here without meeting any Polish people he didn't want to meet. Then he went on the stage, he gave a speech, he came back and he drank vodka, probably.
And then this happened. Kate and Eric were speaking Polish, and Kate said, "Let's tell them about the other secret passages." And then Eric replied, "You mean that there aren't any?" And Kate replied, "What do you mean there aren't any?" And then they started talking like this and arguing back and forth for a few minutes about whether there even were any passages and how many, if so, and so on. So if the guides in the palace aren't sure about what's true and what's not, then that already gives you a sense of how strong these legends are. Leaving Brezhnev Hall and the confusing web of myths and facts behind, we reached Congress Hall.
Congress Hall was the most representative place in the palace. It was designed for 2,800 people, and it was mostly used for Communist Party meetings. The meetings were twice a year, and it was an inside party thing. It wasn't a parliament or anything like this. So party members came here from all around Poland twice a year to discuss future of communism, future of Poland, to vote for new leaders, to make new rules.
Quiz time. John, do you remember how long it took to build the entire palace?
As far as I remember, Leo, wasn't it between 2.5 and 3 years?
Exactly, so listen to this.
Currently, Congress Hall is under renovation, which started in 2014, and it will last until 2020. So it's a paradox when you build a Congress Hall in 3 years and you renovate it for 6 years.
What? They're taking 6 years to renovate something that took 3 years to build? The pace of construction in the 1950s must have been insane. I'm not surprised workers died. Okay, but what else is there apart from all these halls everywhere?
Well, there's a huge Olympic-sized swimming pool, for example. A lot of gyms for children and teenagers. There's a ballet room. There's one for young gymnasts. There's also 4 theaters, a multi-screen cinema, bars, restaurants, a private university, a meeting hall for Warsaw city officials, hundreds of offices, and many, many other places and facilities. Oh yeah, and there's a science museum, I forgot. And also a nightclub with an actual working fountain in the middle of the dance floor.
Oh man, we gotta go there. Gotta get my groove on.
You're on. There are also 2 elevators with famous elevator ladies taking you up to the viewing balcony. They're obviously always full of tourists. Like you can meet a friendly Chinese tourist on your way up.
From television? Me? Original from China?
And a group of even more friendly Spanish guys on our way down. In the background there, you can actually hear one of the elevator ladies saying she's tired and clocking off in 20 minutes. Finally, near the end of the tour, we asked our guides Eric and Kate about the animals.
We have some animals living in the palace. Exactly 16 cats live in the palace basement, and there is a lady hired to look after the cats and to feed them, to play with them. Also, on the top of the building, there is a nest of 2 falcons.
We also have some bees over one of the theaters, because we have 4 theaters in the palace. There is plenty of bees. I'm not sure if you can actually buy some honey from palace, but it's also pretty curious.
Cats, falcons, elevator ladies. Quite a habitat you got going on there. But it doesn't really sound like a gruesome symbol of Soviet domination, more like a friendly public space surrounded by rather friendly legends.
Like I said, the palace is nothing if not ambiguous. As much as it was Stalin's footprint on Warsaw, it also started becoming really useful. It had a swimming pool, cinema, theaters, and Warsaw was still heavily damaged in 1955, so the facilities were really welcome.
When I was a child, it was something in the middle of the empty and ruined, almost ruined city. But on the other hand, every child and every young person was going there for swimming, for taking part in some workshops.
That's the voice of Maria Wojtyszak, a famous Warsaw-based architect.
You know, it was only one, such a kind of the center of cultural life for children. Not only for children, but, you know, I remember it's like this.
So it sounds as if the palace was useful and vast parts of it were really designed for and open to public use. But at the same time, so many people hated it because of what it represented and also because of its brutal mismatch with Warsaw's old architecture.
I heard a joke the other day that puts all of this beautifully. Apparently, it dates back to the 1950s.
Go on.
Why does Warsaw look so good from the palace's top floor?
Because it's the most elevated observation deck in the city?
No, because you can't see the palace from there.
Well, that's how people reacted initially. They couldn't speak their mind freely, so they made tons of jokes about the palace. It also picked up a lot of ironic nicknames. Pekin, which is Polish for Beijing, because the abbreviation of its full name in Polish is PKIN, but mainly because it was also the nickname of the biggest brothel in pre-war Warsaw. It's also called pajac, which is the Polish word for clown, and because it sounds so similar to pałac, which is the Polish word for palace. But for others, it became a serious symbol of power and authority. It went as far as people writing letters to the palace.
You mean people actually wrote letters to the building?
Exactly. People sort of humanized the palace and communicated a wide range of emotions in their letters to it. Listen to what Michał has to say about it.
Hold on. For those who didn't hear our previous episode, let's reintroduce him before we roll the tape.
My name is Michał Murawski, and I'm an anthropologist of architecture. I'm based at Queen Mary University of London. I carried out some fieldwork, some ethnographic fieldwork, some anthropological fieldwork on the Palace of Culture during 2010 and 2011.
So yes, we just had to ask him about the letters.
These are letters that have been collected by the chronicler of the Palace of Culture, who is a lady called Hanna Strubełek, who has been working in the Palace administration since 1960.
Other palace employees say that Hannah is very witty and energetic and that she has an eye for unusual things. She's been keeping a record of all the strange letters sent to the palace.
So you have a lot of requests for the palace to help with some sort of issue that somebody is experiencing. So you have letters written by peasants, for example, who have a conflict with their neighbor over a land plot. They say that the neighboring peasant is infringing on their field, and could the palace please intervene to get rid of the neighbor's attempt to encroach on my plot.
What's even more surprising is the form of these letters.
Some of the letters are written directly to the palace, so they are addressed, "Dear Palace, this is my situation, blah, blah, blah," whereas some of them are written to the administration of the Palace of Culture, or to the mayor of Warsaw, or to the president of Poland, which is considered to reside within the Palace of Culture.
He doesn't, obviously. He has his own presidential palace elsewhere.
Many of them are requests for help. Many of them are sort of political protests. Many of them are quite sad, actually, and sort of full of declarations of longing or of suffering, written by communicated by people who clearly are lonely and have nowhere else to have nobody else to communicate with. So it's interesting that in all these different situations, the palace functions as a sort of vessel for the receipt of these emotions, of these affects, of these desires, and of these sort of unfulfilled ambitions and of dissatisfaction and satisfaction. So the palace functions as a sort of emotional container, and the letters are evidence of that, in a sense.
An emotional container? It's as if the palace is seen as having a divine role, like a pyramid or a ziggurat.
That seems like an accurate comparison. Some of the most unusual letters are written by people who seem to have some sort of mental illness. There was even one lady who wrote that radiation from the palace's antenna makes her have an unwanted orgasm every night.
Ooh, that's a bit cheeky, isn't it?
Yes, very cheeky. But most of the letters simply reveal quite perfectly how the palace has become an almost magical object, a higher entity to which people relate very emotionally. And it's not always positive. During the communist era, many of the letters were anonymous, and people spilled out their frustration and hate for the system, the Soviet Union, and their lack of freedom.
A Polish anthropologist called Zbigniew Benedyktowicz wrote an article about these letters in 1991, and he linked these letters to the sort of totalitarian centralization of power that the palace embodied during the communist era.
People thought the letters would stop after the fall of communism.
But what's interesting is that after 1989, after the fall of communism, these letters kept coming. So the palace has continued to receive all sorts of strange letters.
Also, since the palace had been such a strong and concrete symbol of communism, it became a target for countless attacks after the regime collapsed.
What do you mean exactly?
People were pulling down statues of Stalin and Lenin all over the region, and soon ideas about demolishing the palace started to pop up. The palace became a central point of public debate once again. And it also highlighted how, after all those years, it still evokes strong emotions of a different kind.
Yeah, well, there were a lot of ideas for... I mean, this idea of demolishing the palace has been coming up again and again in the last sort of... not just since 1989, but also before 1989.
Not all of these ideas were 100% serious, though.
Former foreign minister of Poland, Radosław Sikorski, he would be talking about, about Poland's relations with Germany or whatever, and at the end of the speech he would say, and by the way, I also think we need to demolish the Palace of Culture and replace it with a lake.
Swapping it for a lake wasn't the craziest idea.
But people do have their own ideas for how the palace can be altered, or for how the palace can be changed. So some people think that the palace's side wings, which house a Congress hall and several theatres, and the Palace of Youth, should be chopped off, so that the palace is much more of a sort of a freestanding skyscraper, like the Empire State Building, or like a North American skyscraper.
Others went even further.
Some people think that the palace should be covered in glass and turned into a sort of, inverted commas, modern skyscraper. Some people think the palace should be covered in ivy in order to make it more friendly. I also met a lot of middle-aged men who want to he wanted to cover the palace in this sort of glass pyramid in a way to contain it in this sort of Louvre-like I am Pei sort of gone crazy vast glass pyramid.
But other reputable thinkers completely disagree with making the palace feel more pleasant, and they're very serious about it. Czesław Bielecki is one of them. He describes himself as
an architect and political animal.
He believes that
contemporary generation doesn't understand crimes, terror, fear, tortures behind the facade of this building. When Polish patriots spent their lives in communist jails, they were tortured. Parallelly, the leaders of our country and of neighboring countries were praised by the style of this building.
Just to be clear, Czesław believes the main purpose of constructing buildings like the palace was to praise communism and its leaders in a rather primitive form. As he puts it, one they would understand.
Polish communism was not the most dangerous one, uncomparable with Russian or Chinese or Romanian or Czech communism. But I think we need to memorize the communist past and this dream for the future, this utopian power.
His suggestion is that the palace should be emptied and turned into a museum about communism.
And I think Palace of Culture is ideal location and ideal form to cover the whole field of interest for such a memorial, Communist Memorial Museum.
But other people, like Maria Wojtyszak, the architect whose childhood memories we heard earlier, strongly oppose the idea of demolishing or transforming the palace into something else.
I understand people much older than me who were living as a grown-up before the war, who survived, and for whom it was a symbol of Stalinism, was a symbol of everything which was worst, which ruined our life, our mentality, our everything.
As much as she understands the urge to sort of take revenge and erase it from the map, Maria also sees fundamental flaws with that solution.
I think that if after every political change, if you ruined everything which was before, we have any knowledge.
And you know what she did?
What?
She got the Warsaw Society for the Protection of Monuments involved.
Oh, you mean the Warszawskie Towarzystwo Ochrony nad Zabytkami?
Yes, John, that's what I meant. With them on board, she started a movement that eventually managed to put the palace on Poland's registry for objects of cultural heritage, and that was unheard of for a building so young. It means that, at least officially, the palace has been accepted as part of Poland's cultural heritage. And first and foremost, it can't be demolished, changed, chopped, or covered by glass.
So the palace is going to be sticking around for a long time.
Yes, and it'll keep on being Warsaw's involuntary symbol. So you see, the palace isn't only intriguing because it stands out so much or because it's built in this crazy Stalinist Gothic style that looks like nothing else around it. No, the key thing is that this massive building that's often called ugly has become a sort of mirror of Warsaw itself.
A Warsaw that has been through so much.
And the palace mirrors the city's attempts to rid itself of the remnants of its communist past. It mirrors its struggles under new political and economic systems. It mirrors its search for a new identity. It even mirrors the city's inhabitants, divided as they are into those who'd prefer never to discuss communism again, and those who believe it's a harsh lesson we need to remember for a long time.
And most visitors just think it's an Eastern European architectural curiosity, but there's so much more behind it. But after all that's happened, do you think that the people of Warsaw, after all these years, have somehow, reconciled with the palace?
Maybe not all of them, and perhaps not entirely, I'd say, but things seem to be going in the right direction.
It's not purely a generational issue, that it's not as if young people like the palace and old people don't like the palace. There are a lot of people who are middle-aged or who have memories of the palace, both positive and negative ones from their communist era, and they now have described to me how their opinions to the palace shifted over time. So they have become more positive as perhaps this idea, simply the palace was a symbol of some kind of Soviet oppression. When the Soviet Union collapsed, there was no Soviet oppression to speak of anymore. But even the current government, which is very anti-communist in a way, doesn't want to destroy the palace. So there's in a way Poles and certainly people in Warsaw have become reconciled to the palace. It's not so much a symbol of Poland, but it's definitely a symbol of Warsaw and I think it will be a lasting symbol of Warsaw. And it's a symbol of Warsaw because it's a public building in a city where fewer and fewer things are publicly owned, where a lot of previously public space is being developed and privatized. The palace is a remarkable example of a surviving sort of symbol of publicness.
This episode of Stories from the East and West was a Wirewalker studio production for Culture.pl. Our team included Wojciech Oleksiak, Adam Żuławski, John Beecham, Nitzan Reisner, Lea Berio, and our interns Catherine Alberti and Barbara Rogala. A big thanks to Beata Homontowska, Michał Murawski, Czesław Bielecki, and Maria Wojtysiak for joining us on this episode. Make sure to read Murawski's book The Palace Complex if you're interested in learning more about the palace. We'd also like to thank the America program at the Adam Mickiewicz Institute and creators for all their help. To see the notes from this episode, just tap the show art in your podcast app or visit storiesfromtheeastandwest.com. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to subscribe for future episodes. And remember to give us a review on Apple Podcasts. It'll help others find the podcast too.